Hello, Brett. This is your data analysis for the 2020 October, October 16th, I believe is correct. Race at the Cascade Enduro with your BMW Spec E46. Thank you for choosing Data 46 again to look at your data and providing this analysis. We appreciate your continued business. Let's just jump straight into this. So the setup is going to be pretty similar to what we had last time, where we have the GPS lateral acceleration up on the top, the longitudinal acceleration below that, GPS speed, GSum, which is the combination of your lateral acceleration and your lateral acceleration, your pedal position, your brake switch, and then the delta down at the bottom. And just for reference, this is your first session that you sent me, which was which session was that? Let's take a look really quick. That was the first one that started at 1:24 p.m. versus Eric's session starting at 2:59 p.m., where you had a best lap of a 120.316 and Eric did a best lap of a 119.758. So that's what we're comparing. Oh, and then we also have the GPS track map over to the left side here like we did last time. So with that all out of the way, oh, and by the way, your lap is the blue lap. Sorry, you are the blue lap, and he is the red lap. So that should cover everything that we need to know to start getting into analysis. So let's just dive right into it. With turn one, we'll do this in order because you wanted to do a full deep dive analysis. So I figured rather than jumping around, we'll just go turn by turn and sort of work our way around the track, and then we'll finish this off with the key points to take into your next time out on track to work on as a nice conclusion. So getting into the braking for turn one, your braking for turn one is actually pretty good and better than Eric in quite a few regards. So keep up what you're doing, but there's still some improvement that we can make. Notably though, we'll get zoomed in here on turn one, is that you are braking less than Eric is in turn one by about 50 feet. You're braking at about the same point, so there's not a lot of difference there, but you are braking a shorter distance than he is, and you're also braking a little bit harder. So you're gaining time on Eric into turn one with that. The one thing that I would say is that because of this, you can probably get onto the brakes a little bit later, in fact, and I'll explain that a little bit, because what I see here is that your braking performance is not quite as good as it could be based on the performance of the car in other areas. So there's still some threshold up at the top of that braking performance of what you can be doing in deceleration to allow you to get on the brakes even a little bit harder than you currently are, and to take that and also push it a bit further so you're braking less, but you're braking harder. And that will give you more speed off of the front straight, which is a long straight, especially without the chicane on the front straight. So every little bit of speed that you can get out of that front straight is going to be extremely helpful. Which is part of why, if we zoom out, we see on the deltas down here that Eric is actually, that between the two of you, the difference in lap time up until the braking zone is fairly similar. And it's not until we actually get into the braking zone and you are braking that you begin to see a difference, rather than seeing a big spike coming from you staying on the throttle even longer. If you were to do that, then you would see an even bigger gap in time here on the first turn. The only thing I would say is to creep up on this, because you're going to be carrying more speed off of the front straight. If you push the braking zone further, that means you have to be slowing down the car even more to get it to the proper speed to be taking this turn at. So every bit of speed that you carry off of the front straight is going to be a little bit more that you then have to take off, which means it's a compromise in finding that line. But the point is that you have more potential there to go a little bit deeper if you wanted to. One thing I'm also seeing with your braking for turn one, if we zoom in here, is that you start off pretty good. Your initial application to the brakes is pretty firm, and kind of matches up with the performance of the rest of the car. Again, this can be a little bit stronger, so you can get onto the brakes a little bit harder at the very beginning if you want to get a little bit more performance out of the car, judging based off of what should be capable from the car, looking at different areas of the track. But the other thing I'm seeing is that you seem to be releasing the brake earlier and getting off of that pressure before you really need to. So you're not taking full advantage of the traction circle within the braking zone for turn one, which is something I've also seen Eric do. But this is something that you can be doing to improve your braking for turn one, is staying on the brakes harder for a little bit longer and being sure that you're really taking advantage of that threshold braking, getting those wheels stopped just before they're locking up the front tires or the rear tires, depending on the brake balance of the car. But just before that point where they lock up, taking advantage of that threshold braking and getting that extra little bit of braking performance out of the car. Now, it's worth noting that these changes that I'm talking about here, with pushing the braking further and braking harder, may not always be necessary, because particularly in a race environment. Because obviously in an endurance race, like we had at the Cascade event, there are bigger concerns for the performance of the car, such as the wear to consumables and the safety aspect of bringing the car to the limit, where those stints may not be worth that potential risk involved with wearing those brake pads and the brake rotors excessively, or putting yourself into a situation where you don't feel comfortable. But it's still good to know in a qualifying scenario or in a sprint race scenario or just a general track day or a passing situation where if the need arises that you can push just a little bit harder into the braking zone of one. And if you feel comfortable doing that, on every lap of an endurance race, then that's great. You can definitely take advantage of that. But that's one thing that I just wanted to bring your attention to, is that you can be braking deeper and harder longer into the braking zone for turn one. Moving on to the mid-turn for turn one. This is sort of the big difference between you and Eric, where Eric starts to pull ahead of you a little bit. Because what we see is that while your braking was much better through turn one, and you actually carried more speed into the into the first part of turn one, what we actually see is that because Eric was a little bit slower through that first turn, he was able to get onto the throttle more and actually accelerate through turn one rather than just keeping a maintenance throttle. And I believe this was a thing that we talked about on the last analysis that I did for you last year, where you can be pushing a little bit harder through that first turn and actually accelerating through it rather than just keeping a maintenance throttle, and that'll get you just a little bit more speed, or in the case of Eric here, as much as 1.2 seconds, 1.3 seconds almost. So again, we're talking about tenths here, but that's kind of what you're looking at when you're comparing yourself to Eric and his performance over the lap, because you guys have such similar times, and you're starting to get into that realm where rather than talking about taking off half a second or a second or 2 seconds, you're talking about where are these tenths that are going to add up to a big change. So we can see that because of that extra speed that he's carrying, that he's gaining a lot of time on you coming out of turn one. And you initially hold that advantage because of the extra speed that you've carried through turn one with your better braking. But you need to be taking advantage of that speed that you built up and pulling that through into turn two, into the braking zone for turn two, before letting back off the gas. And we can see you're actually getting back onto the throttle through turn one earlier than Eric is. But the difference is that you sort of hold around a third throttle, whereas Eric is really more around 50%, and he's playing with the throttle a little bit more. And then near the end, he gets straight onto full throttle. He has a short period, about a second or 1.2 seconds of full throttle here at the end of turn one, which is just helping him get that extra little bit of speed going into turn two. That actually brings us pretty well on to turn two, where if we zoom in, we see that your braking distances are pretty much identical. The only difference here is that he's braking a little bit earlier and you're braking a little bit later. And from what I could tell, that's not necessarily a huge difference. But what I do find, particularly for you, is that you are building up your throttle through turn two much better than he is. You can see this whole gap right in here where you've got onto the throttle earlier than he has, and it's actually a lot smoother. It's a lot smoother through turn two, rolling onto the throttle, than Eric is, because you can see Eric sort of gets on the throttle, he's a bit hesitant, and then finally gets on. So you're starting to build up some speed again on him just because of that. Now, going back to the braking for turn two, as I said, we can see that your braking point is actually pretty similar. But the difference here between you two, where Eric holds a little bit of time on you, is you're braking harder on the braking zone for turn two than Eric is in the same amount of distance. So what this means is that you're over slowing the car for turn two. So this leaves you with two options for improvement. The first option would to be actually to reduce your braking pressure for this turn and keep the same distance for braking, allowing the transition of your braking to balance the car more. So that transition between braking and turning the car and getting back onto the throttle is going to be smoother. Or the alternative to that is to keep your current brake pressure, but to reduce the distance that you're braking. And it's really up to you which you choose to do. And it's going to come down to what you feel at any given point in the car. If you feel that the car is being unstable in the transition from turn one to turn two, particularly related to the braking, I would say go for option one, where you're keeping the same braking distance but just backing off of that brake pedal a little bit. You're not quite as hard on it, because this will help settle the car without sacrificing the speed, because we know from Eric's data here that he has that speed with this brake pressure. If, however, the car feels stable under the current braking conditions for the transition between turn 1 and turn 2, I would say go for option 2, which will shorten the braking distance but keep the same braking pressure. So you're not slowing down as much, but it allows you to carry more speed out of turn 1. So those are your two options for turn 2, the way I see it, to try and gain some of this time back and possibly even be a little bit faster than Eric through that turn. Now, another thing to note here is the line that Eric takes coming out of turn 1 and how that influences his line through turn 2. So if we look, we can see that Eric, who again is the red and while you are the blue, takes a wider line out of turn 2. And while this doesn't look like a whole lot, if we actually measure it out, it's about 8 feet from the center of the car to the center of the car, which is a couple feet more than the width of a BMW E46. So what that means is that he's tracking out at the exit of turn 1, and we can see that he's actually taking about the same line through turn 1. It's just the exit that's different. He's taking a wider line on the exit of turn 1 by a bit more than a car width. And while that's not a huge difference between times per se, and it's really not something that we can see in the deltas here that specifically is due to this fact. What we know from Racing 101 is that a bigger radius equals higher speed. And while Eric may not be taking advantage of that higher speed that he's getting from that wider line, we know that he has the opportunity for that line, and he's not going to be wearing the tires or any other part of the car nearly as hard by taking that line. And he's also not sacrificing his braking zone by doing this. He still has the time and the distance to make that braking zone a straight shot, which is right in there, which again is about the same as you are. It's a tiny bit earlier, but to all intents and purposes, pretty close. And I wouldn't consider that a noticeable change to make in your driving style performance-wise when it comes to the time deltas. So he is getting a little bit more speed from that, and he's also tracking out a little bit more on the exit of turn 2 to just carry that speed a little bit more, whereas you're keeping it a bit tighter, which, you know, will just keep the car a bit more responsive because it's not nearly as tight. It's not nearly as loaded up as it is if you were to hold it out a little bit more. So that's something you can experiment, see how you feel if you do that. Really more on the outside here of on the exit of turn 1 than I would say on the exit of turn 2, because he's really not making that much of a gap in terms of the line on the exit of turn 2 as he is for turn 1. But what I would say here is that because of this, it would stand to reason that taking advantage of this wider line for you simply comes down to faith in the car to stick at higher speeds and your confidence with the size and the placement of the car on the racing surface. And this is going to just come down to seat time, really. There are some things you can do with mental imagery before you get out on track of imagining where you want the car to be and imagining how you want the car to feel when you get it out onto that wider line But really, until you just hang it out there and see what it's like, you're not going to necessarily be able to just build that confidence. So that would be what I would say, is to try and build up that confidence in where the car is on track, and having the confidence in the car that at these higher speeds, that the car is going to stick and do what you want it to do, which is a confidence thing. It's something that you have to build up to with these higher speeds, like we have it on the sweeper for turn 1 and turn 2 here, and also in turns 11 and 10 and 11 on the back straight at PIR, where these are high confidence corners. You know, they're high speed, they're pretty narrow parts of the track, so it's easy to get kind of concerned about whether or not the car is going to stick and do what you want it to do, and it's not going to run wide. But what I'm seeing with Eric here is that the car has the ability to hang wide. You just have to trust it to do that. Finally, like I think I mentioned earlier, your throttle application through turn 2 actually looks pretty good, and it's better than Eric's. You're rolling onto the throttle you're starting the throttle at about the same point, but you're rolling onto it much more smoothly than he is, and we can see that right here, where yours is much more of a linear progression up to full throttle, and you're getting on full throttle earlier, quite a bit earlier than Eric is, whereas Eric is getting onto the throttle a little bit and then sort of holding there and then going into the full throttle. So I would say your throttle application in that regard is pretty good, where you're rolling into it very smoothly and not hesitating, not jumping onto it. You're just getting that throttle down as you should. So good on that. Keep doing that. Moving on to turn 3 here. There's not a lot to note. You guys were pretty similar in terms of pace. The only big thing that I noted was the line that he's taking versus you, where he's taking the apex just a little bit tighter. And again, this isn't worth a whole lot. It's definitely not showing a whole lot in the data here. But what it is showing us is that, just the basic rules of racing 101 again, where a shorter distance will almost always be faster. So getting closer to that apex, getting closer to that curbing on the inside of 3, and trying to hold that more will probably do you good. It won't necessarily bring you tenths or even hundreds, but it may be a couple thousandths, and that could be worth something at some point, and just help get you up on that advantage over Eric. Now, getting into turn 4, this is a big spot that I noticed for a time difference between the two of you, and it's a great example of slow in, fast out, because what the main difference that I saw between the two of you that's giving Eric such an advantage is he's actually getting onto the brakes earlier than you are, and he's coming off of them earlier than you are, and you guys are braking at about the same level, about the same braking characteristics, but he's getting into that braking section a little bit earlier so that he can then carry the mid corner speed onto the back straight. And what we see is you guys actually get onto the throttle at about the same point. And he does get back to full throttle a little bit earlier than you do, by about 100 feet or about a second. But that's not really the big difference, because we can see if we zoom out and look at the entire back straight here, where once you actually get onto the back straight, you guys start to level out and you're pulling about the same. But the big difference here is that you're down on speed by just a couple miles an hour, but that's enough where it's worth about a quarter of a second. So what we want to do here is just bring that braking zone forward just a little bit. It's not a lot. It's about 25 feet. Just bring that entire braking zone and shift it back. You're not trying to get off the brakes at the same point. Bring that back as well. And just try and carry as much of that speed as you can through the mid corner. And one thing that Eric is doing that's helping him carry the speed is he's taking a more parabolic line through this hairpin going onto the back straight of turn 4, instead of doing what you're doing, which is pinching it a bit more and really trying to straighten out that run onto the back straight. What he's doing is he's running it out a little bit wider, so this curve is actually a little bit smoother, and then he's getting to that outside curbing sooner, which gives him a straighter run once he gets onto the curbing here. So those are sort of the big things for the first half of the track to think about. And like I say, that turn 4 is, as far as I can tell, one of the really big spots, particularly in the first part of the lap where Eric has an advantage on you. So trying to incorporate that slow in, fast out is going to help you onto the back straight here. Now moving down the track, we get into turn 10, 11, and 12, which of course is at the end of the lap off of the back straight. And he gets a huge advantage on you going into turn 10 here. And the big reason for this is just braking. What he's doing is he's braking about 50 feet less than you are in total. So he's actually getting onto the brakes a little bit later than you are by about 25 feet. We can see right here, excuse me, getting onto the brakes about 25 feet. So we'll zoom in here just so you get an idea of what that difference is. So we have right about here is where you're getting on the brakes compared to Eric getting on the brakes right there. So, you know, it's not a lot, but it just means that Eric's carrying that little bit more speed off of the back straight than you are. And then he's also getting off of the brakes again about 25 feet earlier. So in total, his braking distance is about 50 feet less than yours is. So where he's braking before he actually turns in, you're braking once you start to look into turning into turn 10 here. And your throttle application is actually a little bit better than he is. But I want to focus really quick on the speed differential, because what we can see here is that this braking difference between the two of you means that he's as much as 7 miles an hour up on speed through turn 10 than you are, which is just massive. That's why he's getting this advantage that he is of, again, about a quarter of a second. If I can get the delta going here, it's pretty significant. It's about 0.222 seconds is that difference. So it's pretty big. Just that 50 feet of braking is absolutely massive. Now, going back to what I was saying about the throttle, because this sort of leads into that, is that Eric actually doesn't get onto the throttle in the same way you do. And so you start to bring some of that time that you lost back. It's not a lot, but it is a little bit of time back, because what he's doing is he's holding off on the throttle and he's just sort of feathering it, going through 10 and 11. He's just sort of playing with that throttle to keep the car balanced, but he's not really maintaining the speed. So what's happening as he's going through 10 and as he's going through 11 is he's still bleeding off speed. Whereas what you're doing, you're actually on the throttle as soon as you get off of the brakes for 10. You're getting back onto the throttle and you're holding that throttle. So you're maintaining that, keeping that maintenance throttle through 10 and 11. And that means you're actually starting to build up a little bit more speed going through 10 and 11, which is the ideal way to take this turn. You want to slow down and then build your speed back up. If not, just simply maintain the speed that you have. Whereas Eric is losing speed consistently because he's just sort of coasting through this. So you're doing good on that. You just got to bring that braking zone tighter. You got to get on the ball there a little bit and tighten that up, and you'll see some real improvements through that. And it's going to feel a lot faster. I mean, it's 7 miles an hour we're talking about, so it's going to be a bit of a pucker moment, you know, but once you get it down, once you get that feeling of how the car sets into that turn, I have a feeling that you're going to be able to take what you already know you're doing well about that turn, which is getting back onto that maintenance throttle and holding it there. And you're going to pick up some time on Eric. And that's the main difference through here. And then the final difference to sort of close out the lap, your guys' braking points for turn 12 is actually pretty much exactly the same. I mean, you're within literal feet of one another here. I mean, we'll take a look. I mean, yeah, literally 6 feet is a difference, and that's marginal. I wouldn't consider that to be substantial in really any way at the performance level either of you are at. I mean, maybe if you were an IndyCar driver, then we would be saying those 6 feet are crucial, but you know, at the club level or even a regional level, I don't think that 6 feet is going to be worth anything substantial to really worry about. The big difference that I can tell in turn 12 that sort of compounds onto the front straight and is also going to have an impact on the next lap, because of course you're on the front straight. It's 2 things. One is the throttle application between the two of you and the line that each of you takes. So we'll get into the throttle first, because that's one thing that's pretty easy to work on. So what we can see here is Eric is rolling into that throttle really smoothly. A lot like you were doing in turn 2. He's just rolling into that throttle nice and smoothly, all in one action. He's not hesitant. He's not, you know, jumping onto anything. He's just getting up onto it real smooth, which is helping him get to that throttle, that full throttle earlier, because you get onto the throttle about the same point between the two of you. But he's just getting onto it earlier, which of course is going to help him carry that speed on the front straight. Whereas what happened here is you got onto the throttle a little bit about halfway, and then you held that for a second before going to full throttle again, which would tell me that there was something that happened in that split second where you lost confidence in what the car was going to do. Perhaps you felt like the car was tracking out a bit too much, and you weren't sure that you would be able to keep it on the track without, you know, running wide off of the edge of turn 12, or you thought perhaps you were going to end up scraping against the tire barrier on the exit of turn 12 or something like that, or the car just stepped out a little bit on you. But really what happened was you jumped onto that throttle a little bit too quickly, and then something happened, something clicked in your head that you didn't like, and so you just held it rather than continuing to get onto the throttle. So that's going to be a big thing, is just making sure that you're not getting onto the throttle until you know that you can get onto the throttle all at once through this turn, because you want to carry as much speed onto that front straight as you can. And obviously you want to get back to the throttle as soon as you can, but you also want to be getting to full throttle as soon as you can. That's the biggest thing coming out of 12 here, is not so much the way you get onto it, but how quickly you can get back to full throttle. So if you have to wait a split second maybe to get onto the throttle so that you can get onto the full throttle quicker, I would go for that option. And one thing that Eric is doing that's going to help him in this matter is the line that he's taking, and he's taking more of an approach like you did in turn 4 here, the hairpin onto the back straight, where he's pinching it a little bit at the beginning, but that's allowing him to straighten out his run onto the front straight and give him a little bit more breathing room on the outside of the turn, so he's not worrying about the running off of the track on 12 or running into the tire barrier on the side. And it's just giving him that little bit of breathing room, especially since this is an off-camber corner and it likes to push your car out wide as you go around it, as you carry speed. Taking that line that allows you to sort of cut across it more rather than being a passenger of the terrain, it's probably giving him just a little bit more space to feel comfortable and feel confident in what the car is doing, and then allowing him to get onto the throttle sooner. So those are sort of the big things that I saw looking at your data. All in all, it looks pretty good. You seem to be using pretty good use of the traction circle and the traction performance of the car. So it's just these little things that are amounting to a couple tenths here and there that are going to help you, that if you implement them correctly, can definitely get you under that 120 barrier and into the 19s and competing against Eric, if not actually beating him. So in summary, to sort of cap things off, some key points to work on. If you were going to take anything from this video today and apply it into your next session without feeling overwhelmed, just some key points to focus on while you're out there. It's turn 1, creep up on moving that braking point back a little bit and using the brakes harder and making sure that you're keeping that brake pressure up at the tire threshold, at the brake threshold, so that you can carry that speed off of the front straight as much as you can, and maximizing the performance, the grip performance in that braking zone for turn 1. And that, and just using some more throttle through turn 1, like we talked about before and like we talked about last year. Just getting onto that maintenance throttle quicker and trying to actually build up speed more than just maintaining a speed. It's going to help you a lot through that section. And then going into turn 4, moving that braking section back, not just your initial braking point, but just the entire section. Keep doing what you're doing pretty much, but just shift it back a little bit. Do it a little bit earlier so you can get a better run through the turn and carry a bit more speed. Is going to be a big help, because it's not so much the application of the throttle going out of that turn that you're really losing to him, because we can see you're getting onto the throttle roughly the same, and once you actually get onto the back straight, you're not really losing time to him. Your guys' speed traces are pretty much on point. It's just he's carrying that much more speed through that corner than you are, and that he's just holding that pace now down the back straight. And finally, shortening up that braking zone into turn 10 is going to be really massive. It's going to give you a pretty substantial amount of time if you can do that a bit later and get off of the brakes a bit sooner. So you're bringing that back by about 50 feet in total of braking distance, and then just trying to carry that speed through 10 and 11 as best as you can. I mean, your throttle through there is pretty good as it is, but it's just taking that and applying this new braking technique that's really going to put you on the same league as Eric. And those are the big things that are worth a lot of time right now for you. Other than that, you look pretty good. From what I looked at, there's nothing glaringly obvious that's wrong. If there are any other particular areas that you want me to look at, definitely send me a message, send me an email, and I'll be happy to talk with you more and look deeper into it. If you want to look at consistency within your sessions or lap to lap or anything like that, let me know. I'll definitely dive into that more. From what I saw, you look pretty good there, so I'm not too concerned, but I can definitely work on that more if you feel like there's an improvement to be made there. Of course, you can check out my website at www.data46.racing to see any of the other services that I offer, to see if there's something in there that interests you going into the 2021 season. And I just want to thank you for your continued support in this business. I appreciate you considering the analysis that I'm providing you as beneficial to your driver development, and I hope you continue to feel that way and want to include me in the rest of your season for next year. But anyway, I'm going to leave it there and wish you a good night. You take care.